Imagine driving your car to work, getting stuck in a massive traffic jam, and realizing you're idling your engine on the exact same 102-meter street grid laid down by ancient urban planners,
Huh.
like 2,300 years ago.
Yeah, it's pretty wild to think about.
Right. I mean, for you listening right now, you aren't looking at ruins behind a velvet rope. You aren't reading a dusty plaque about a dead civilization. You are sitting inside an urban landscape that is aggressively, continuously alive.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what makes this specific city so unique.
So today, we are unpacking the ultimate survivor city, which is Thessaloniki. You handed us a really fascinating stack of sources for this deep dive.
You did, yeah. We have some great material to work with today.
We've got a highly detailed master's thesis on the city's Byzantine era. Then there's an archaeological breakdown of its Hellenistic and Roman architecture, and a broad sweep of its entire 23rd century historical arc.
It's a lot of ground to cover, but the narrative through line is just incredible.
It really is.
Yeah.
And our mission today, looking at your research, is to answer a very specific question. How does a single city continuously reinvent itself over and over?
Right, without ever losing that core identity.
Exactly. Surviving collapsing empires, pirate sieges, catastrophic fires, and just total demographic wipeouts without ever losing its original urban DNA. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Well, what's fascinating here is that the answer really lies in the mechanics of its geography and its status.
The geography super statistic, right?
Yeah, we are looking at what geographers call a hinge city. Thessaloniki physically connects the Balkan Peninsula in the north directly to the Aegean Sea in the south.
Oh, wow. So it's literally a hinge.
Precisely. Culturally and economically, it acts as the hinge swinging between east and west. Unlike cities that, experience a massive golden age and then fall into permanent ruin.
Like Pompeii or Troy or something.
Exactly. Unlike those, Thessaloniki demonstrates a completely uninterrupted chain of urban evolution.
And looking through the history you provided, a massive part of that evolution stems from its perpetual status as the second city.
Yes, the runner-up status. It's crucial.
It was second to Pella in the ancient Macedonian era, then second to Rome, second to Constantinople, and, even today, it is second to Athens.
Which you'd think would be a disadvantage, but it wasn't.
Right. We are going to explore how operating as the runner-up actually became its secret tactical advantage. But to understand the survival of a 2,300-year-old urban machine, we have to look at the literal hardware it was built on.
The physical layout from 315 BC.
Yes, the blueprint. So walk us through that.
So the foundational blueprint is really a masterclass in ancient political and spatial engineering. Cassander, who was a successor to Alexander the Great, didn't just casually build a town.
He kind of forced it into existence. Right?
He did. He executed what's called a synoecism. That's a deliberate, forced consolidation of 26 smaller surrounding villages into one single metropolis.
26 villages. That is not a small undertaking.
Not at all. And he named it after his wife, Thessaloniki, who happened to be Alexander the Great's half-sister.
Nice little political flex there.
Oh, absolutely. But by forcibly moving these populations, Cassander instantly generated a centralized tax base, a massive labor force, and a highly defensible stronghold.
But he didn't just, mash 26 villages together and hope for the best either.
No, the planning was incredibly precise.
The archaeological sources you gave us emphasize that the city was designed using the Hippodamian system, which wasn't just a crude map. It was a highly sophisticated approach to zoning.
It was essentially ancient gridiron planning.
They laid out a grid of horizontal and vertical streets forming exact blocks of 102 by 58.5 meters, which is crazy specific.
And we know they used it for navigation, too.
Yeah, there is that incredible detail in your sources about a 2nd century AD funerary inscription. It explicitly mentions the Purple Dyers of 18th Street.
The Purple Dyers of 18th Street.
They were utilizing a numbered street system in antiquity. It's like they were playing an ancient game of SimCity, laying down a grid so perfect that people are still driving on it thousands of years later.
Well, the genius of the Hippodamian grid is that it mathematically guarantees order, right? But it also anticipates future density.
Because it standardizes everything.
Exactly. It standardizes property lots, which theoretically promotes a degree of civic equality among the original settlers. Plus, it establishes these permanent arteries for commerce and water drainage.
I look at that and wonder how a rigid mathematical grid survives an imperial takeover, though. because shortly after this, the Romans conquer the region.
And they bring massive infrastructure with them.
Right, they drive the Via Egnatia, which
Mhm.
is their massive transcontinental highway connecting Rome to the east, straight through the heart of the city.
Which changes everything.
And because the city backed Octavian and Mark Antony, it gets declared a free city. You suddenly have Italians, Jews, and Thracians just flooding in.
It becomes incredibly cosmopolitan very quickly.
But it seems counterintuitive. Wouldn't a rigid, pre-planned grid completely choke under the weight of an unexpected cosmopolitan population boom?
You would think so. But the grid functions much like a computer motherboard.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, it doesn't choke under new hardware. It actually provides the literal slots for new components to plug into. The Romans understood this perfectly.
So they didn't just rip it all up.
Not at all. When they initiated their massive public works, they didn't bulldoze the Hellenistic city. They utilized the existing slots.
Oh, okay.
The archaeological data from your sources highlights the Roman Forum as a great example. During the Hellenistic period, those specific city blocks were zoned for heavy industry.
Like pottery and metallurgy, right?
Exactly, metallurgical workshops. So the Romans simply cleared those specific blocks, snapped their grand administrative center into that exact space, and tied it directly into the existing street grid.
It is the literal definition of modular urban evolution. They just hot-swap the industrial zone for an administrative center without touching the underlying operating system.
Which is exactly why it survived.
That level of modularity brings us to a critical pivot point in the sources. By the late 3rd century AD, this motherboard is functioning so efficiently that emperors decide they want to live there.
The second city almost becomes the center of the world at this point.
It transitions from this bustling provincial hub to a glittering imperial residence under Emperor Galerius.
Galerius commands a total architectural overhaul of the eastern sector. He constructs a sprawling palace complex, a hippodrome for chariot races,
This is massive, yeah.
and the triumphal arch, the Camara. He built that specifically to broadcast his military victories over the Persians to anyone traveling the Via Egnatia.
He also commissions the rotunda, this huge, imposing circular structure. And your sources highlight a major historical correction here that I found fascinating.
Yes, the rotunda's purpose has been misunderstood for a long time.
For centuries, the academic consensus was that the rotunda was built as Galerius's personal mausoleum. But recent archaeological excavations in eastern Serbia uncovered his actual tomb.
Right, in ancient Dardania, which was his actual homeland, they found a walled palace called Romuliana.
So if the rotunda wasn't a tomb, what was the actual mechanism behind building it?
To understand the rotunda, you really have to look at the political operating system of the time, which was the Tetrarchy.
Right, the 4 co-emperors.
Exactly. Emperor Diocletian realized the Roman Empire was just too massive for one man to rule. So he divided power among 4 guys, and Galerius was one of them.
Okay, so where does the rotunda fit into that?
The rotunda was engineered as a pantheon for the official gods of this new tetrarchy, specifically Jupiter and Hercules. It was built to enforce the imperial cult.
Great. So it wasn't a burial site at all.
No, it was a massive piece of architectural propaganda. It was designed to legitimize a brand new, decentralized form of government to the masses.
And the ultimate validation of the city's strategic value comes shortly after Galerius, with Emperor Constantine.
Yes, Constantine really shakes things up.
He moves in, makes Thessaloniki his strategic headquarters, builds a massive artificial harbor for his fleet, and spends 2 years just pouring resources into temples and baths.
He was heavily invested in the city.
According to the historical texts in our stack, Constantine seriously considered making Thessaloniki the brand new capital of the Roman Empire.
He did, before ultimately pivoting to Byzantium and creating Constantinople.
Right. If he hadn't changed his mind, you and I will be talking about the Thessalonian Empire today. That is wild.
It's a huge historical what if.
But it makes me wonder, how does constantly being the bridesmaid, and never the bride, actually shape a city's operating capacity?
Well, the failure to become the capital was arguably the greatest geopolitical gift the city ever received.
Julie, how so?
Because in the resulting Byzantine era, Thessaloniki earned the title of Symbasilousa, which means the co-reigning city.
The co-reigning city. I like the sound of that.
Operating as the runner-up provided a highly lucrative buffer. The city was deeply embedded in the empire's massive trade network, funneling all this wealth from the Balkans into the Aegean.
But without the headache of being the capital.
Exactly. It was physically far enough away from the emperor's immediate gaze to escape the suffocating, micromanaged bureaucracy of Constantinople.
So they basically get all the economic perks but keep their independence.
Yes, this spatial autonomy allowed local governance, independent mercantile guilds, and a distinct regional culture to rapidly scale up.
Being a wealthy, autonomous hub is incredible for the economy, obviously, but it paints a massive target on your back.
Oh, absolutely. Wealth always attracts attention.
If the foundation of the city is its physical grid and its political autonomy, the true vulnerability is defense. Which brings us to the year 904 AD.
A very dark year for the city.
The city features formidable fortifications on land. Those walls successfully repelled the Goths, the Avars, and the Slavs. But the seawalls facing the southern harbor were dangerously low and essentially just ignored.
Because the central Byzantine administration operated under the absolute assumption of naval supremacy.
They just didn't think anyone could touch them on the water.
Right. For centuries, the empire controlled the sea routes. So the concept of a massive, organized naval assault on a major internal harbor seemed tactically impossible to the bureaucrats in Constantinople.
And that assumption gets completely shattered by a Saracen pirate fleet sailing up the Aegean.
Commanded by a Byzantine defector, no less, Leo of Tripoli.
Because he is a former insider, he knows exactly how weak those southern seawalls are.
He had the exact intel he needed.
And the response to this crisis is detailed in an incredibly vivid first-hand account by a captive cleric named John Comeniates. And honestly, it is an administrative catastrophe.
Comenius provides a brutal autopsy of what happens when you outsource your defense.
Yeah, it's just a mess.
The local population had wealth and autonomy, but they lacked an independent standing army. When the threat appeared, they were entirely reliant on military directives from Constantinople.
And the emperor sends a revolving door of, middle management generals to fix it.
It is almost comical if it weren't so tragic.
First, a commander named Patronus arrives. He looks at the low sea walls and decides the best move is to literally sink massive, ancient Hellenistic stone tombs into the harbor.
To create an underwater barricade.
Right. The locals start physically dragging monuments into the sea. But before the barricade is finished, the capital replaces Patronus with a new general, Chetzelakis.
Who has a completely different plan.
He immediately aborts the underwater barrier strategy and orders everyone to frantically build the physical seawalls higher. Then he suffers an injury and is completely incapacitated.
So they have to send a third general.
The third general, Nikitas, abandons the wall construction entirely. He gambles the city's survival on allied Slavic archers from the countryside who never even arrive.
It's a complete failure of leadership.
Why is the military strategy shifting so wildly in the middle of an active siege? It's like changing the head coach of your football team 3 times during the Super Bowl.
Well, the mechanism of failure here is the fatal disconnect between a distant central authority and immediate local reality.
They just didn't know what was happening on the ground.
Exactly. The second city's superpower vanishes when survival is dictated by political appointees. They just drop into a crisis without understanding the terrain, the local capabilities, or the urgency.
And Leo of Tripoli obviously exploited this bureaucratic paralysis.
He absolutely did. His forces bound their ships together in pairs, constructing massive wooden siege towers across the decks.
Oh, wow. Floating siege towers.
Yeah, they simply sailed these floating towers up to the neglected, half-finished seawalls and bypassed the defenses entirely.
And the resulting sack of the city is just a nightmare. 30,000 citizens, including the cleric Comeniates, are taken captive and sold into slavery.
Total devastation.
Total annihilation of the urban infrastructure is only averted because a Byzantine official named Simeon happened to be in the city with state funds.
Funds that were intended for Sicily, right.
Right, and he used that gold to bribe the pirates to finally leave. The trauma is profound. Yet, the sources you compiled emphasize that the recovery was shockingly fast.
It was, because the physical motherboard, the harbor, the grid, the geographic location, survived intact.
It's that grid again.
Yes, the physical infrastructure allowed the economic engine to restart. But the cultural infrastructure is what allowed the city to synthesize its trauma.
What do you mean by cultural infrastructure?
Well, the architecture from the post-Sac period perfectly illustrates how Thessaloniki operated. Look at the Church of Panagia Chalkion, built in 1028 by a royal official named Christophoros.
Oh, this church is a brilliant case study.
It really is.
Because Christophoros brings in the absolute cutting-edge architectural tech from the capital, right? The hidden brick technique.
Exactly. The hidden brick method involves recessing alternate layers of brick and covering them in thick bands of mortar.
So it's not just a structural choice.
No, it was the visual language of Constantinople's elite. Utilizing this technique was a massive aesthetic flex.
You showing off.
Completely. Christophoros was using architecture to project imperial wealth and broadcast his direct connections to the highest levels of power.
But the local labor force doesn't just execute a corporate franchise build. They take this elite imperial styling and deliberately subvert it.
They make it their own.
Yeah, they incorporate curved pediments and adjust the spatial proportions to match local Macedonian traditions. It's the architectural equivalent of taking a strict corporate guideline from the capital and applying a heavy, regional indie spin.
I love that. And that synthesis of imperial ambition and local reality really mirrors the demographic mechanics of the city at the time.
Because the demographics were super mixed.
Very mixed. At the same time, the city is hosting the Demetria, which was a massive international trade fair every October.
Drawing people from everywhere.
Right. They're actively pulling merchants from Italy, the Black Sea, and Celtic territories. And simultaneously, they're integrating the surrounding Slavic populations right into their economic grid.
They are essentially a cultural translation engine.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
I mean, this is the exact city that launches the missionary brothers Cyril and Methodius. They literally invent the Glagolitic alphabet to translate the Bible for the Slavs.
It was a hub of knowledge transfer.
But this capacity to absorb and translate is pushed to the absolute limit as we move into the Ottoman era.
Yes, a major, major shift.
In 1430, the Byzantine Empire loses control, and the city is conquered by the Ottoman Turks.
And the initial phase of Ottoman rule brings severe demographic and economic stagnation.
The sources say it almost felt like the city was dying.
It did. But the trajectory completely flips in the late 15th century due to a massive external geopolitical event.
The arrival of the Sephardic Jews.
Exactly. Tens of thousands of Sephardic Jews fleeing the Spanish Inquisition and expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula are invited into the Ottoman Empire.
And they heavily settle in Thessaloniki.
They do.
The sources state they completely revitalize the economy. But how does a traumatized refugee population single-handedly reboot an entire urban economy?
Because they brought highly specialized technological and financial mechanisms with them.
Like what, specifically?
Well, the Sephardic refugees possessed advanced knowledge of wool weaving and textile manufacturing from Spain. Furthermore, they brought established pan-Mediterranean mercantile networks.
Oh, so they were already plugged into the global economy.
Exactly. They arrived, looked at Thessaloniki's deepwater port, recognized its historic role as the Balkan hinge, and seamlessly mapped their international financial networks directly onto the city's ancient commercial slots.
Wow. They essentially installed a massive new economic processor onto the existing motherboard.
That's exactly what happened.
And for centuries, this creates a wildly cosmopolitan reality.
Yeah.
You have massive populations of Jews, Muslims, and Greeks just coexisting, driving the local economy.
It was a golden age of pluralism.
By the late 19th century, they are laying down tram lines, installing gas lights, and building rail connections to Central Europe. The city becomes such a hub of free-flowing ideas that it serves as the ideological incubator for the Young Turk movement.
Which eventually overthrows the Ottoman Sultan.
Right. It was a thriving incubator for radical political and economic thought. But then, the 20th century subjects that pluralistic society to a brutal series of existential stress tests.
It really is a staggering whiplash of modern history.
In 1912, the Greek army liberates the city during the Balkan Wars. Just 5 years later, in 1917, a catastrophic fire ignites and incinerates almost the entire historical center.
The destruction from that fire is almost unimaginable.
Yet when you look at the urban planning documents for the rebuild, the core layout that survives and dictates the new modern city is that exact same Hellenistic grid designed by Cassandra's architects.
The buildings burn, but the math holds.
The math holds. The physical grid survives the fire, but then the demographics are forcibly rewritten by geopolitics.
Yes, following the Greco-Turkish War.
Between 1919 and 1926, a compulsory population exchange is enacted. Tens of thousands of Muslims are uprooted from Thessaloniki and sent to Turkey.
While roughly 100,000 Greek Orthodox refugees fleeing Asia Minor flood into the city,
The entire cultural balance is violently recalibrated almost overnight, rendering the city overwhelmingly Greek.
a complete demographic overwrite.
And then, the darkest mechanism of the 20th century arrives. During World War II, the city falls under Nazi occupation.
The tragedy here cannot be overstated.
The vibrant, centuries-old Sephardic Jewish community, the exact descendants of the people who rescued the city's economy 400 years prior, is systematically annihilated.
Over 40,000 Jewish residents are forced onto trains and deported to Auschwitz.
It is a catastrophic, permanent amputation of the city's soul. When you absorb the sheer scale of these shifts, empires falling, neighborhoods burning, entire populations exiled or murdered, it forces you to question what actually constitutes the identity of a city.
Well, the identity is the accumulation of those layers. We tend to define resilience as stubborn permanence, like a boulder resisting the ocean.
Just standing still and taking hits.
Right. But the data in your sources suggest urban resilience is actually the capacity for absorption. Following World War II, the city once again absorbed massive waves of internal refugees.
They just kept taking people in.
They aggressively expanded their academic infrastructure, turning the Aristotle University into an intellectual powerhouse for the Balkans. They rebuilt their industrial base.
And by 1997, Thessaloniki was crowned the European capital of culture.
Because the city survives by treating trauma and influx not as the end of the story, but as new data to be integrated into the foundation.
It is the ultimate testament to the durability of a good blueprint. From a grid forced into existence by a Macedonian king, to the modular absorption of a Roman highway,
To the fatal miscalculations of Byzantine bureaucrats.
and the brutal demographic rewrites of the 20th century, Thessaloniki proves that if the underlying framework is adaptable enough, a city can survive the end of the world multiple times over.
It really is incredible.
It really makes you evaluate the ground you walk on. For you listening right now, consider the layout of your own neighborhood. How many invisible grids, vanished industries, or buried political decisions are silently dictating the exact path you take to the grocery store today?
To build on that, consider the tension between intent and accident. We examined how Emperor Constantine made a highly calculated, deliberate decision to move the center of the world away from Thessaloniki.
Right, a choice that shaped global politics for a millennium.
Exactly. But we also observed how an accidental spark in a kitchen in 1917 burned down the city center, inadvertently giving modern urban planners a blank canvas to redesign the 20th century capital.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about it like that.
It raises a fascinating question to walk away with. How much of the human timeline is actually steered by the grand, deliberate designs of visionaries and politicians, and how much is simply the cascading result of random disasters that force us to start over?
That is a brilliant tension to leave us with. Thank you for bringing us this stack of sources and joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of survival. Keep analyzing the structures around you and keep questioning the history beneath your feet.